Like, share and comment on our videos and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. Join the only official Telegram channel of Rouse IAS Study Circle to stay updated and get all the materials on the Telegram. The link to the channel can be found in the description of the video. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 13th of March 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion. So prelims is just around the corner and we know that testing is an essential part of the preparation. And so just like past years, Rouse IAS Study Circle has come up with Pre-Parikshan, which will be all India mock of GS1 paper. And the first test of Pre-Parikshan will be held from 19th to 21st of March. The result shall be announced on 22nd of March. And this is going to be absolutely free for everyone. A unique feature of Pre-Parikshan 2021 is the scholarships. 100% scholarships for PTS and QIP 2021 for top 50 test takers and 50% scholarship for Prelims Test Series and QIP 2021 for next 100 test takers. The test will be conducted in an online fashion and all those who are already members of eLearn need not register again. You can straight away attempt the test when it is visible to you in your account. But if you're not a member, you just have to register yourself on eLearn platform, the link to which shall be provided in the description of the video. Along with the results of the test, you are going to get All India ranking, question level analysis to identify strong and weak areas, the comparative analysis of your marks with that of average and top performance, and that shall be followed up with live online test discussion. So compete in All India Pre-Parikshan 2021 and check your preparation 3 months before the examination. The first article for discussion is a very important one from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination, and that is Right to Information Act. Rajasthan Information Commission penalizes 5 officials for negligence. And so the Rajasthan Information Commission has adopted a tough stance against government officials showing negligence in providing information under RTI. Now if you look at UPSC syllabus, you will find right to information mentioned at 2 places. Directly under GS Paper 4, Ethics, Integrity and Aptitude, you will find right to information. Whereas in GS Paper 2, it clearly says important aspects of governance, transparency and accountability. And RTI is one of the main tools through which the transparency and accountability is enforced. And so in this particular discussion, we are going to first understand the historical build-up which led to the passage of RTI Act, mainly dealing with the movement led by Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan. What were the obstacles or the restrictive legislations which prevented the flow of the information in pre-RTI era? Then we will understand the basic provisions and important provisions of the RTI Act. And then finally we'll look into the issues with respect to the implementation of the RTI Act. So let us now begin the discussion. So all of us understand that access to information, and greater the access to the information which the citizens has, the greater will be the responsiveness of the government to the community needs, greater will be the transparency, and hence the government shall be accountable. And that is what the purpose of all reforms is all about, to increase the transparency and accountability in the government. But if you look at pre-RTI era, when citizens did not have the Right to Information Act, there were a lot of reasons because of which the information was restricted, or rather the flow of the information to the citizens was quite restricted, and that was because of a lot of restrictive legislations, a lot of rules and regulations which put a lot of curbs on the government departments and officials and public functionaries, so that even if they wanted to give information to the citizens, they were not legally allowed to do that. For example, we had and we still have Official Secrets Act 1923 and Indian Evidence Act. Both of them put a lot of conditions, and those are a matter of another discussion, but still you should remember that because of these 2 acts, a culture of secrecy and arrogance existed within the bureaucracy, and combined with this, there was low level of literacy and rights awareness amongst people of India. And so 2 to 3 decades after the independence, people started to think that they should have more information about how the funds are being invested or being spent, what are the actions and steps which are being taken for them which are not reaching them. And so you can say that the RTI's journey can be traced back to 1987. At a Rajasthan small village, Dev Dungri. So in 1990s, a collective known as Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan was formed with the motive of demanding minimum wages for farmers. So while struggling for the implementation of their own legal right, the members of the organization realized that to enforce their economic rights and exercise democratic controls, they needed the right to access the documents, because unless and until they have access to documents, unless citizens see the documents of their own entitlement, they will not be able to fully assert themselves. Now, in case of Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, this information was stored with the government and had been kept secret from the people. And so they began demanding transparency of financial records of expenditure in the panchayat, the village council. Their demand for transparency, accountability, and social audit began with the first public hearing in 1994. And the revelations of these first few public hearings led to an immediate and sharp reaction from the government officials, who refused to share information and made it clear that in their view, people had no right to access such documents. And from there began a movement which ultimately culminated in 2005 RTI Act. Because many such public hearings were being organized throughout the country, through which people increasingly began to demand information about their own rights and entitlements from the government officials. And they started realizing that the main idea behind the information being kept was not the benefit of the people, but was to prevent any step from the citizens if they want to uncover any kind of corruption. In the meanwhile, Supreme Court had already upheld right to information as a fundamental right flowing from Article 19. And so that also gave a lot of push towards a legislation to ensure that information flows to the public. But even after recognition of the right to information as an essential part of Article 19 by the Supreme Court under different judgments, the system of governance in India was opaque, because we still had Official Secrets Act. Then we also still have Evidence Act 1872, which prohibits the giving of evidence from unpublished official records without the permission of the head of the relevant department. Then we had Central Civil Service Code rules, which strengthens the provision of Official Secret Act, which prohibits government servants from communicating any official document to anyone without authorization. So what you have without RTI is just rules and regulations which only talk about not to give information to anyone without the authorization of the head of the department. And since giving of information can be so risky that no government official could even dare to publish any information, even if it did not relate to any kind of corruption or scam. And so that is why Indian governance was shrouded in secrecy, and the culture of secrecy had developed. And so that is why Parliament enacted Right to Information Act 2005. And so first we are going to understand the basic provisions, the very, very important provisions from the perspective of prelims examination. Once you understand these provisions, only then you will be able to understand the full potential of RTI Act as far as governance reforms in India are concerned. So first and foremost, when we talk about right to information, right is understood, is an entitlement. But what is information? So Right to Information Act under Section 2F clearly defines all types of objects and things which can be considered as an information. So the type of information which may be obtained can be form of any material, any opinions which have been expressed by government officials, advices, press releases, circulars, orders, reports, any records which have been kept in a government department, documents, memos, emails, or any other kind of digital record, logbooks, even contracts given out by the government. And one of the most important aspect of RTI Act is that even an information which is related to a private body, which can be accessed by public authority under any law for the time being in force in our country, can be categorized as an information. So not just the government records, but also the private records, if they can be accessed by the government officials or public authorities, can be sought as an information under RTI Act. But the question arises, who can, or who are the people who can seek this information? And so this has been given in Section 3 of the RTI Act, and as per the section, any Indian citizen can seek information under the Act. And so you have to keep in mind that a foreigner coming to India cannot file an RTI application, and that has to be sought by an Indian citizen. But that can only be done as far as it concerns with a public authority. So you cannot go to a private company and seek any information using RTI Act. But that is only applicable for public authority. So what is actually public authority? And that also has been given under RTI Act. So, any authority or body or institution of self governance established or constituted by or under the Constitution of India. And so now you can clearly see what kinds of bodies we are talking about, whether it is Election Commission, CAG, or any other body or authority constituted or established by law, which means statutory body. So you have constitutional bodies, now you have statutory bodies, and this law can be made either by parliament or by legislature. So now we are talking about both central level statutory as well as state level statutory bodies. And then finally, apart from these, all bodies notified by the central or state government, including those bodies owned, controlled, or substantially financed, as well as NGOs that are substantially financed by the government. Now, question arises as to why RTI Act has taken so much of pain to define these public authorities. And the reason behind that is that if citizens want information, information first has to be collected, sorted, arranged, and maintained. And so that is why public authorities has been created, because it shall be primarily their responsibility. And so if we talk about RTI Act, it has defined 4 major obligations or responsibilities as far as these public authorities are concerned. First and foremost, they shall maintain all their records duly catalogued and indexed to easy access of information. If the information is just piling around randomly, and if a citizen of India comes and seeks information, the authority cannot provide that information. So the first step is proper maintenance of the information. Then, if the information is computerized, it becomes easy to access. And so public authorities must ensure that all records are computerized within a reasonable time frame. Then an obvious question is that if an information is sought from a department, not all people can be held responsible for the information, right? And so under the RTI Act, every public authority must designate an officer as Central Public Information Officer or State Public Information Officer, as per the case may be, but this has to be done by all of them. And so these are the people, CPIO or SPIOs are the one to whom all the requests of RTI are transferred, and they are legally responsible for issuing or furnishing of the information. And then finally, it is better if all the information is already available in the public domain, right? You don't have to seek all the information. And so some of the minimum information should already be voluntarily uploaded by these public authorities in public domain. And so that is also one of the responsibilities which have been given in the law. And so all the public authorities have to publish all the particulars of their organization, be it functions, duties, powers of officers, procedures and process followed by them in decision making, categories of documents held under their control, directory of officers and employees, budgetary allocation to its agencies, and many other factors. And now just try to recall, whenever you have visited any government website, you must have seen about us, functions, our officers, directory containing their numbers. All these are result of Right to Information Act. And now question arises that when the information has been so widely described by RTI Act, is there any kind of information which can be exempted from disclosure under RTI Act? Because if you include opinions, advices, records, memos, emails, so it will include everything. But the problem is that some of these information can even be detrimental to society in particular and country in general. And so that is why RTI Act itself has provided few exceptions or exemptions. So some of these exceptions you must have seen under Article 19(2), which are of course reasonable restrictions on freedom of speech and expression. For example, any information which when disclosed would affect the sovereignty and integrity of India, scientific and economic interests of the state, relation with foreign state, or would lead to incitement of an offense cannot be disclosed or can be exempted from disclosure of RTI. Then, if there is a judicial intervention with respect to 2 things. First, any information which has been forbidden to be published by any court of law or tribunal, or the disclosure of that information would lead to contempt of court, cannot be revealed in RTI. Also, any information which would impede or which would disrupt the process of investigation or apprehension or prosecution of offenders cannot be disclosed in RTI. Then, any information, the disclosure of which would cause a breach of privilege of parliament or the state legislature cannot be disclosed. Then, RTI has also ensured that disclosure of such information which would hurt the commercial interests of the companies cannot be disclosed. For example, any information including commercial confidence, trade secrets, intellectual property, the disclosure of which would harm the competitive position of a third party cannot be disclosed under RTI. Then, of course, any information, the disclosure of which would endanger the life or physical safety of a person cannot be revealed, and any information which relates to personal information and which has no relationship to any public activity or interest cannot be revealed under RTI. Now, as we have already seen within the RTI Act, the bodies have been made to ensure that all the complaints are resolved with respect to the implementation of the RTI Act. And Central Information Commission, which is a statutory body set up under RTI Act 2005, is the topmost body at an all India level to ensure the proper implementation of the RTI Act. And so it is important to look into some of the features and powers of this body. And so starting with the constitution or the membership. So Central Information Commission is a group of people consisting of Chief Information Commissioner and other Central Information Commissioners not exceeding 10 members. They shall be appointed by the President on recommendation of a committee consisting of PM, Leader of Opposition, and a Union Cabinet Minister nominated by Prime Minister. Now in this part, there has been some of the changes in last year when the Government of India amended the RTI Act 2005 through an amendment act. Now you have to let us know in the comment section what has changed as far as removal, grounds of removal and procedure is concerned. This has been already discussed in our Daily News Simplified multiple times. So do let us know what are the changes which were brought about by RTI Amendment Act 2019. And let us just quickly discuss the functions of CIC. And first and foremost, as we have already discussed it, receive and inquire into complaint from any person with respect to the implementation of the RTI Act. So what are the issues which citizens can face as far as RTI Act is concerned? First is that citizens go to a public authority and the authority refuses to provide the information which citizens think is unjustified, and so they can challenge that decision of public authority in CIC. Then a lot of RTI requests go unresponded, and so they can challenge that lack of response in CIC. Then a lot of information required a lot of expenditure as well. For example, if you asked a detail of all the expenses being carried out by a particular department in last 10 years, it may require photocopying a lot of documents. And so that shall be borne by the applicant, but the kind of expenditure which has been demanded by the department could be unreasonable, and that can also be challenged in CIC. And any other matter related to implementation of RTI Act which citizens think is not according to the law can be challenged in CIC. As far as powers of CIC is concerned, CIC has powers of a civil court, and at the same time it also acts as an appellate body, which means that if a citizen has walked into State Information Commission and if the decision was not in her favor, they can challenge the decision of SIC in CIC, and so it is also an appellate body. But the functioning of RTI Act in last 14 to 15 years has not been quite up to the mark, or not been the way it was expected or designed to act. And hence, obviously it leads us to question that why it has not been able to function the way it was expected to. And there are many reasons for that. And one of the major reasons behind the issues being faced by RTI Act is the very short implementation time of this act, which did not provide time for either the people in the government as well as common people and their mindset to change. It was not sufficient to create infrastructure, develop new processes, and build new capacities in order to implement various kinds of provisions and mechanisms envisioned in the RTI Act. And hence, a lot of issues have emerged. So one set of issues can be categorized into demand side of the information. This pertains to the information seeker side, and it deals with the issues and constraints faced by the information seeker while filing for information request. Then comes the supply side. Now, this dimension pertains to the Public Information Officer's nodal department for RTI implementation and various kinds of other interdepartmental challenges which deal with the supply of the information. And finally come the adjudicatory side, or the issues being faced by the information commissioners or commissions. So we'll discuss them one by one. So let us now start with demand side issues. And one of the major problems in the implementation of RTI Act is the low public awareness. Now at this point of time, you should know that Section 26 of the Act states that the appropriate government may develop and organize educational program to advance the understanding of the public, especially the disadvantaged communities, regarding how to exercise the rights contemplated under the Act. But a survey conducted by Department of Personnel and Training has found out that nodal departments and state governments have not undertaken any substantial steps to promote the RTI Act. The ultimate result is that awareness level is very, very low among the disadvantaged communities, especially the women and people belonging to SC/ST sections. Then the next major hurdle in the demand side of the problem is the quality of awareness. And this deals with the awareness regarding types of organization covered under the RTI Act. And it is important to highlight that the quality of RTI awareness among common people is very, very low. For example, the results of a survey conducted by Central Information Commission is displayed on your screen. The table on the screen illustrates the percentage of the people who responded in affirmative to the questions analyzing the table. You can easily see how low the quality of awareness is among the general public. For example, only quarter of the people surveyed in Andhra Pradesh had the awareness that they have the right to ask for all information provided about any organization. And hence it can be said that while the Act has been clear in defining the responsibility of the appropriate governments, especially with respect to creating awareness of the Act, there has been a lack of initiative from the government side. These efforts have not been helpful in generating mass awareness of the RTI Act. So the first two issues related to demand side deal with the lack of awareness and education on the part of the public. This is a fault of not only the public itself, but it is also a failure of the responsibility given to the government to carry out the mass level awareness programs. Then moving on to the issues related to constraint faced in filing application. And again, various sections of the RTI Act themselves mandate many of the things which are not being conducted. For example, under the Section 6 of the RTI Act, PIOs are required to provide reasonable assistance to the applicant in drafting and submission of the applications. But more often than not, it was found out that this assistance is denied when a person walks into an office of PIO, citing busy schedule as one of the most frequently used alibi. Then the Section 26 of the RTI Act makes it a duty of appropriate government to publish and distribute user manuals or guidelines, which will be read by the applicant in order to fulfill the procedures. Similarly, Section 27 and 28 specify the responsibility of the appropriate governments to make rules pertaining to the implementation of RTI Act. Let us see how various states have fared. Just take the example of publication of user guides. Considering only these 5 states, you can see that none of them at the state level have published the user manual. Also, the standard format for filing of applications has not been given out by Andhra Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh as well as Assam. So these are the hurdles being faced by the applicants as far as the demand of the information is concerned. Another issue observed in the survey was that the payment mechanisms prescribed in some of the state rules are very inconvenient to the citizens, especially those applying from the locations outside the concerned states. For example, the application fee in Odisha can only be paid through treasury challans and banker's check. So these are the kinds of small bottlenecks which the applicants face. Then comes the issue of poor quality of information which is provided, because more often than not, the way in which the information is communicated to the RTI applicant leaves them extremely dissatisfied. Now you need to understand that the quality of information or the response provided is a direct consequence or even the function of record management practices within the public authority. The way in which record is maintained, ultimately it is going to decide how the information is disseminated. Then also the kind of processes and the transparency which has been adopted in those processes in between or in within the offices will also determine the quality of the information or the data. Because if there is a lot of opaqueness in which a particular office functions, then obviously the data cannot be revealed with full transparency. Then also the training of the public information officer is very, very crucial. If the person is not trained properly, which is often the case with Indian offices right now, there is a very little diligence while giving the information out to the public. And finally, there is also a problem in the way RTI applications are drafted by the common citizens. And obviously, because they do not get the kind of support they are assured by the RTI Act, drafting does becomes an issue. And finally comes the issue of constraints faced in inspection of records. Now, Section 2J of the RTI Act provides for the inspection of the official records, which says that right to information means the right to information accessible under this act, which is held or under the control of any public authority, and it also includes the right to inspection of work, documents, records, taking notes, extracts or certified copies of documents or records, taking certified samples of material, and obtaining information in the form of floppies, tapes, video cassettes, and various other forms. So these are also a right under Right to Information Act. But to your utter surprise, there are hardly any offices currently in our country which allows open inspection of their records. And the major reason behind that is inadequate awareness of this particular provision of the RTI Act. So far we have discussed the issues on the demand side of the RTI. Let us now focus our attention to the supply side of the RTI Act. And let us now begin the discussion on the supply side issues, or the issues being faced on the side where the information is being supplied. RTI Act maintains the issuance of information within 30 days, but currently there exists no measure and process for an information commission to view the adherence level of this provision of the Act. Then the next major set of challenges come from the training as well as motivation of the public information and first appellate authorities. We know that the level of training of these two institutions is very, very low. For example, a study conducted by Central Information Commission found out that only 55% of those surveyed had received any kind of training in dealing with the RTI Acts and its provisions. And one of the major reasons cited behind that was the frequent transfers of public information officers. You know that these officers are the personnel of the same department who are then deputed as PIOs. And before they can learn all the sections and details mechanisms of the RTI Act, they are transferred into some other kind of responsibilities within the department. This also places an additional workload on the training institutes entrusted with providing RTI training. Here it is also pertinent to mention that PIOs lack motivation to implement RTI Act. PIOs have often cited that there is no incentive for them in order to take such a huge responsibility. And PIOs at state level are generally not provided with any kind of support staff. So from photo state and Xerox to disbursement of the information, all are done by a single person, even at the highest level of the bureaucracy. Then comes the way in which the records are maintained in our offices. And you know that obsolete record management guidelines owe their genesis in ineffective record management tools being utilized by the government offices, as well as lack of collection of information from the field offices. And hence it can be said that current record management framework at state and central level is not geared to meet the requirements specified under RTI Act. There is a lack of any electronic document management system in any department, especially on the state level, and majority of PIOs do not even maintain the list of RTI applications electronically. So these are the troubles from the demand side, especially dealing with the record management guidelines. Then comes a very, very major issue, which is non-availability of basic infrastructure. Because the implementation of the RTI requires the PIOs to provide information to the applicants through photocopies and scans, that is also in soft copy. While these facilities are considered to be easily available at district level, it is a big challenge to get information from block level and panchayat level offices. PIOs highlight that the lack of infrastructure hampers the RTI implementation at the panchayat level. For example, up to 97% of the panchayat and block level offices did not have any kind of photocopier. Then comes the issue of limited usage of information technology. The usage of IT in acceptance or delivery of RTI applications is very minimal. The maximum usage of IT in the field of RTI is development of few softwares to track the status of the RTI applications. Beyond this, no other IT solution has been developed by any state or even the central government. And this has led to a lot of problem in the way RTI applications are being disposed of and especially slowed them down. And last but not the least, ineffective implementation of section 41B. Now, as per this particular section, one of the basic responsibilities of the public authorities is to disseminate information on a suo motu basis, or we can also call them automatic disclosure, because section 41B specifically mentions the type of information which needs to be provided by the public authorities automatically even before someone goes and seeks the information. The Act also mandates to provide other information directly to the public. Now, the usual problem with the government offices is that first, the automatic disclosures are not made. If they are made, the disclosures are not regular. Most of the disclosures do not contain the date on which they were updated. So it could be 10 years old as well. And there is no mechanism within the public authorities to implement these provisions or to ensure its implementation. And neither the state government nor the information commissions have taken adequate steps to ensure compliance of this basic minimum requirement for filing RTI applications. So these are the issues when it comes to the supply side of the information. And finally, moving on to the issues faced at the information commissions. Under the section 25(1) of the RTI Act, Central Information Commission as well as state information commissions are required to submit an annual report on RTI implementation. There is no need to mention that no state or central government so far has done that on a regular basis. Then these information commissions have a perception of being lenient towards the public information officials, and that is born out of the fact that a very low number of PIOs have been penalized so far. Although the information commissions have the power to instinct the public authority to compensate the complainant for any loss or other detriment suffered, however, the information commissions have rarely used their powers. Then comes the lack of monitoring and review mechanisms. Under various sections of the RTI Act, both Central Information Commission as well as State Information Commission have the power to require the public authorities to take necessary steps to secure the compliance with the provisions of this Act. Also, high level of pendency in RTI applications is not hidden from anyone. And finally, the geographical spread of information commissions is such that it leads to a lot of disparity, because majority of information commissions are situated in state capitals, which results in appellants undergoing an additional cost in order to attend the hearings. So these are the major challenges in the way RTI Act functions in our country. Although you can see that mechanisms and provisions are given in the Act itself, but more often than not, the main challenge is to implement and successfully implement those issues on the ground. Let's now move on to the next discussion. Stop influx from Myanmar, says Center, appears on page number 10. And so the Ministry of Home Affairs has written to the Chief Secretaries of Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram and Arunachal Pradesh to take appropriate actions as per law to check illegal influx from Myanmar to India. And this is a result of current internal situation in Myanmar. We know that a military coup has taken place, and as an aftermath of that, a large-scale migration is expected to occur from Myanmar to India. Being a UPSC aspirant, we cannot be clueless about what's happening in the neighboring countries, just like this girl was, who was doing her regular aerobics classes out in open without realizing that a military coup was taking place right behind her. Therefore, we are going to start the discussion by first understanding what is the overall importance of Myanmar in Indian context. Then we are going to understand the historical perspective as to how this problem has a roots in recent history as well. And then finally we are going to understand what should be India's policy towards this evolving situation in Myanmar. The relation or the bilateral relation of India with its neighbors are very important, and Myanmar being one of the very important neighbors, although not very significant and active player in India's foreign policy, but nonetheless is important. It's important mainly because of two reasons. First is that Myanmar, which in the map is located towards the eastern side of India's northeast, is the link to the ASEAN countries. ASEAN, which is the future of the global economy. We want to connect to ASEAN, and for that, for the land connectivity, Myanmar is the only option for us. We know that Myanmar itself is a member of ASEAN. It's an ASEAN nation, is also a member of BIMSTEC. And so you can say that Myanmar is the common link between the South Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries. The second important reason why Myanmar is so significant is because of our Northeast. We know that through land borders, we connect to the Northeast via Chicken's Neck. It's not only very narrow, but it is also very vulnerable because of the Chinese threats. And so we always want to create multiple ways to reach to our Northeast. And one of the ways is, of course, Bangladesh, and another way is through Myanmar. Reaching Myanmar through Bay of Bengal and then taking the land or the river route into our Northeast. Not only that, people settled along the borders of India and Myanmar share common cultural links. And so, if we can somehow connect both sides of the people through economy, it will lead to a multiplier effect in the Northeast. So now, since we have clearly established the significance of Myanmar in India's overall scheme of things, let us now quickly go over to the historical perspective so that you are in a better position to appreciate what has happened day before yesterday. So since 1990s, Myanmar was in the military control. But in 2008, constitution obviously was drafted by military, people who were actually controlling the political affairs of the country. And so in the constitution, they inserted a lot of conditions, and the conditions were such so as to make it impossible for Miss Aung San Suu Kyi to become president. Because the first condition was that to become a president of Myanmar, you must have military experience. That is the first condition. Then the second condition was that the family members of the president, including the president, must be Myanmarese citizens. Now we know that Miss Suu Kyi's sons have British nationality. So on both these counts, she was debarred to become president. Apart from that, there were three conditions put in the constitution itself which would ensure the perpetual control of military junta over internal and external affairs of the Myanmar. For example, in the constitution of Myanmar, it is written that the Ministry of Defense and Interior Ministry, which is like Home Ministry, will be controlled by military, and 25% of the total seats in parliament shall be reserved for military people. So military retained the control of internal affairs as well as the borders, and it also through this amendment ensured that whatever political decisions are taken inside the parliament, military will have a say on that. And so the first elections were conducted in 2010 under the changed constitution. And so the party which is most liked by the people, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, which is National League for Democracy, was not recognized, and so it boycotted the elections. Then in 2015, due to increasing international criticism and domestic pressure, most of the political prisoners belonging to National League for Democracy, including Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi herself, were released. Elections were conducted and her party came up with thumping majority. Then in 2020, next elections were conducted where her party secured 396 seats, enough to give her clear majority. But since the results of these elections have been declared, the army is not at peace. According to army, there were terrible frauds in the voter list in parliamentary elections held in November 2020, and the election commission failed to settle the matter, claiming that this development would seriously impinge the path to democracy. The army declared an emergency, transferring all the powers to Commander-in-Chief himself. And finally, day before yesterday, all the power has been grasped by the military junta. Now in this respect, the comments from India have been very measured. India has expressed deep concern over the reports of an unfolding military coup in Myanmar and has also stressed that rule of law and the democratic process must be upheld. But unlike in the past, because the last time when the coup happened in late 1980s, India's response was very fierce. But that has changed, and that has changed keeping in mind India's national interest. Because India has adopted a particular policy towards Myanmar. And let us now discuss that. And so India's policy towards Myanmar is first and foremost characterized by non-interference in Myanmar's internal matters. Myanmar has been making news since last 20 to 30 years because of the dictatorship of the army there. Although India has supported democratization of Myanmar since 1990s, but India always wants that change to come from inside, driven from within the country. Now this has allowed Delhi to engage with the military of Myanmar as well as whichever party backed by the military is in power there. The second important aspect of India's policy towards Myanmar is that India wants engagement to supersede the criticism. India, of course, realizes the problems which Myanmar has created. For example, for India as well, the Rohingya crisis, which has led to the deluge of refugees inside India as well as in Bangladesh. But instead of criticism, India relies more on engagement with Myanmar to somehow resolve this problem so that the repatriation of these Rohingya refugees can be carried on. But other countries have resorted to criticism, but India has chosen engagement. Now we are aware of the increasing influence of China in the Indian subcontinent, and of course Myanmar is no exception, and not many countries have set up their embassies and offices in Myanmar, but China was the first one. And so, Myanmar's growing closeness with China and the recent proposal of China-Myanmar economic corridor is a cause of concern for India. And so, India wants to counter the increasing Chinese influence in Myanmar through increasing engagement. And so one of the pillars of or the motivations behind India's policy towards Myanmar is to counter the increasing Chinese influence. Of course, there are some problems with respect to the implementations of the projects on ground on which we are outpaced by China always, but India has tried to manage that. Then India has based its engagement with Myanmar on strategic infrastructural development, be it the proposal to build a petroleum refinery in Myanmar that would involve an investment of around $6 billion, or the commitment to operationalize crucial Sitwe port in Myanmar's Rakhine state, or be it India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway as well as Kaladan multimodal transport project. So all these are India's commitment towards infrastructural development in Myanmar. Of course, some of them are for the India's own benefit. For example, the Kaladan multimodal project, which will be a connectivity project which will involve, of course, Sitwe port development and then utilization of Kaladan river going up to Paletwa and then finally taking the highway to the Mizoram border. So that way we are trying to reach Mizoram by taking help of Myanmar, and of course Myanmar is supporting us in that. And then the issue of border management confronts both these nations. There are insurgent movements going on which are troublemakers for both India as well as Myanmar, and hence there is a lot of scope in border security and development cooperation. And that is why India's response has been particularly measured when it comes to military coup in Myanmar, because we need the continued support of Myanmar not only to solve our internal issues challenges but also to counter the increasing impact and influence of China in South Asian region. Democrats cannot be state election commissioners appears on page number 1, where the Supreme Court yesterday held that independent persons and not bureaucrats should be appointed state election commissioners. This was with reference to the appointment of Law Secretary of Goa as an additional charge of state election commissioner. So in this particular discussion, we are going to understand the provisions of state election commissioners which have been given in the Constitution of India. Before we do that, let us have a look at two questions. And these are just two questions, but many other questions have been asked. For example, in 2016, UPSC asked, consider the following statements. The minimum age prescribed for any person to be a member of Panchayat is 25 years. A Panchayat reconstituted after premature dissolution continues only for the remainder period. Then in 2011, UPSC asked the Constitution 73rd Amendment Act 1992, which aims at promoting the Panchayati Raj institution in the country, provides for which of the following? Constitution of District Planning Committee, State Election Commissions to conduct all Panchayati elections, establishment of State Finance Commissions. And then comes that provision because of which we are discussing the whole constitutional provision, and that is related to elections to the Panchayats, which is dealt with in Article 243K. Which says the superintendent's direction and control of the preparation of electoral rolls for and the conduct of all elections to Panchayat shall be vested in State Election Commission consisting of a State Election Commissioner to be appointed by the Governor. Then what are the securities or the guarantees provided to the Election Commission? That is given in clause 2. Subject to the provision of any law made by the legislature of a state, the conditions of service and tenure of office of the state election commissioner shall be such as the governor may by rule determine. But provided that the state election commissioner shall not be removed from his office except in like manner and on the like grounds as a judge of high court. So although the states have power to legislate the terms and conditions and tenure of the office of a state election commissioner, but his or her removal has been specified by the constitution, and that has to be on the grounds and on like manner of a judge of a high court. And the condition of service of a state election commissioner shall not be varied to his disadvantage after his appointment. So these are the securities being given to the state election commissioner. Some of the important articles which you should remember from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination is Article 243B, which deals with the constitution of panchayat, Article 243C, which deals with the composition of panchayats, Article 243D, which deals with the reservation of seats, then Article 243G, which deals with the powers, authority and responsibility of the panchayats, and Article 243H, which deals with powers to impose taxes and funds by the panchayats, and finally Article 243K, which deals with the elections to the panchayats. Now, whenever you have to quote the deficiencies in our panchayat system, you can say one of the deficiencies is that constitution does not mandate the delegation of the power as stated in Article 243G and H, where the constitution uses the word may rather than shall. So this very important news with respect to international relation appears on page number 1. Quad leaders for open, free Indo-Pacific. So the first Quad summit and the first Quadrilateral's virtual summit was organized yesterday, where the premiers of 4 members, Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India, President Joe Biden of United States, Yoshihide Suga of Japan, and Prime Minister of Australia Scott Morrison participated in this virtual meet. And so, in this regard, we are going to discuss what leaders said, analyze their statements, what are the issues which Quad members have with China, and the significance. So all 4 members committed themselves to a free and open Indo-Pacific region. By this time, we already know the main intention behind the formation of Quad, and that is to counter the increasing influence of China in South China Sea in particular and in Indo-Pacific region in general. And so all of them committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific region. All of them reaffirmed their commitment to cooperation on COVID-19, security and climate change. They pledged to respond to economic and health impacts of COVID-19, combat climate change, and address shared challenges including cybersecurity, critical technologies, counter-terrorism, quality infrastructure investment, and humanitarian assistance in times of disaster. All the 4 nations align themselves and converge as far as denuclearization of North Korea is concerned. They also committed to deliver up to 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine to the Association of South Asian Nations, that is ASEAN countries and Indo-Pacific countries by the end of 2022, and that shall be mainly led by Indian manufacturing facilities along with US and Japanese funding and Australian logistical support. So these are the main takeaways as far as yesterday's summit is concerned. But what are the points for analysis? And we can clearly identify 5 such trends. First, each of the leaders have tried to make it clear that it is not an anti-China club, even when it aims to counter the rising influence of China. But it has a wider purpose. Now, Quad is trying to showcase what democracies can deliver together, both for their own populations and for the broader world. But even after such declarations, the alliance is still viewed as an effort to combat Beijing's growing military and economic power. After all, it is a group of countries, all of which are concerned about China, all of which are trying to hold the line for an open, democratic, non-Chinese way forward. The Quad is not a formal alliance in same way as NATO is, and thus carries no strict duty to defend one another, and that is one of the challenges of Quad. Now we already understand what issues China has with India, but not all of us are clearly aware about the rivalry which China shares with other members of Quad. So starting with US, relations between US and China have deteriorated with clashes over trade, COVID-19, Hong Kong's autonomy, Taiwan, and alleged human rights abuses in Xinjiang region of China. If you know, America has labeled China as America's biggest geopolitical test of 21st century. Apart from America, Japan has had long-standing grievances over contested islands. Let us know in the comment section which are those islands which have led to a lot of acrimony between China and Japan. Also, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, Australian government has officially stated a lot of things which has not gone down well with Beijing, and that has led to deterioration of relationship. And Australia has faced trade pressures from Beijing, and just yesterday, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that the Quad meeting was historical moment and an opportunity to create a new anchor for peace and stability of Indo-Pacific. So now you can see that not only these countries are converging against China, but they are equally vocal against China as well, because they are giving statements against Chinese government on public platforms. And this group gained a lot of boost last year after India invited Australia to join naval exercises with it, which is that exercise in which the Australia was invited. So what has been the significance of this summit yesterday? Now, first and foremost, India has been established as a leading manufacturer of vaccine, and it is a success of India's vaccine diplomacy, because all these four countries have agreed that they are going to provide vaccines, around 1 billion of them, to the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific region, and all of them shall be manufactured in India. Apart from this, the countries are also focusing on the creation of resilient supply chains for materials such as rare earth metals, because we should know that we are critically dependent on China when it comes to rare earth metals. China produces 60% of the world's rare earth metals, and this collaboration is crucial in countering China's dominance on these metals. And these are very, very important metals because they are used in smartphones, automobiles, electric vehicles, and batteries, which is the future. And so if we remain dependent on China, it's not good for us, and all these countries are now collaborating as far as creation of supply chain independent of China is concerned. Also, this summit and the statements given by US President reflects a continuity in US foreign policy, because a lot of people had expressed concerns that there shall be a break in the policy after the takeover of the presidency by Joe Biden. But all such apprehensions have been put to rest because of the summit yesterday. And also, it is the first plurilateral summit attended by Joe Biden after assuming office, and it reflects the importance given by him to the important matter of China. Casting the Asian Dice on a West Asia Board appears on page number 6 as an editorial. Now, this month, a contingent of Indian Air Force, including fighter aircraft and over 120 personnel, participated in multi-nation exercise hosted by United Arab Emirates, and the exercise is Desert Flag. Now, these military exercises have been very, very important from the perspective of prelims examination. Whereas the article goes on to discuss a lot of complexities of the West Asian geopolitics, which have already been discussed multiple times in our DNS, we are going to focus ourselves on the prelims perspective of Desert Flag exercise and the map location of Strait of Hormuz So, Desert Flag exercise is an annual multinational large force employment warfare exercise which is hosted by UAE's Air Force in Gulf region. Started on 3rd of March and will run till 27th of March at Al Dhafra Air Base in UAE. Indian Air Force has participated with 6 Sukhoi 30 MKI, 2 C-17s and 1 IL-78 tanker aircraft in the exercise. As far as aim for Indian Air Force to join this Desert Flag exercise is concerned, the main aim is to provide operational exposure to the participating forces while training them to undertake simulated air combat operations in a controlled environment. The participating forces will get an opportunity to enhance their operational capabilities along with mutual exchange of best practices. Apart from that, the large-scale exercise involving diverse fighter aircraft from across the globe will provide the participating forces, including our own IAF, a unique opportunity to exchange knowledge, experience, enhance operational capabilities, as well as interoperability. Exercising and interaction with the participating nations in a dynamic and realistic warfare environment will also contribute to strengthen international relations. As far as Strait of Hormuz is concerned, it is a strait between Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. It provides the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean and is one of the world's most strategically important choke points. Now, on the north coast lies Iran, and on the southern coast, the United Arab Emirates. An important feature of Strait of Hormuz is that a third of world's LNG and almost 25% of the total global oil consumption passes through this strait, making it a highly important strategic location for international trade. So this last article for today's discussion appears on page number 6 as lead editorial. The new media rules are tightening news. Now this topic has already been discussed in detail in DNS dated 26th of February 2021. But we are going to just highlight the problems which the author cites in the notification. So all of us know that Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code Rules 2021 has been notified in February by Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. The overarching intent of this new set of rules is to put in place a grievance redressal mechanism for the end user or consumer of social media and over-the-top platforms and the digital news web portals. Now, according to the author, there are several problems in this particular notification. Now, according to the author, the worrying aspect of this notification is that it invokes and insinuates the idea that the public or the users need to be protected against the very media that in fact seeks to make them critically informed citizens, thereby making their democracy that much richer and deeper. Then the smaller or medium-sized independent digital news and current affairs portals, which are for most part struggling to stay afloat, will be the ones hardest hit by this redress requirement. Any criticisms of the ruling party or the government could trigger an orchestrated avalanche of grievances. The notified rules set out an elaborate time-bound three-tier process whereby each and every such grievance is first handled at the level of the portal itself by its own grievance officer, and if not satisfactorily settled, passes on to self-regulatory body of the sector or the industry, and if yet not resolved, moves further up to an inter-ministerial oversight committee of the central government. Now, the notification gives the Secretary, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, ad hoc emergency powers to block any content the government considers problematic even without such procedure. The process further makes a mockery of the concept of self-regulation, with an interministerial committee of government officials in effect becoming an appellate authority over the self-regulatory exercise. Now, it is important to take a step back and remind ourselves that the fourth state or the fourth pillar is as much player as the three pillars, the executive, the legislature and the judiciary, in the separation of powers scheme of the constitutional democracy. And so, the fourth pillar of democracy must be in a dynamic relationship of checks and balances vis-a-vis the other three pillars. It is a healthy tension among the four pillars that keeps the democratic edifice strong and vibrant. Now, according to the author, because of these loopholes, the government is going to increase the control over the free and independent media which he thinks might come under the control after these regulations.